And Tim, I'm going to hand this over to you in terms of helping us get faster at any age on the run and talk a little bit about track workouts.
All right. So when Hillary asked me to cover this topic, the first thing I said is, are we talking about track workouts only? And what we're really going to talk about, and it will encompass track is workouts, but we're going to talk about doing speed and strength sessions. Okay. And they don't always need to be done on the track. Personally, I might do one track workout a year. But I do plenty of speed and strength sessions. A lot of people do them because the track is where you run fast, right? You see it in the Olympics. Usually every high school and middle school has one. There's no traffic, stop signs, red lights, crossings. And plus, prior to COVID, when everybody did things in groups, it's really easy to do speed sessions on the track because it doesn't really matter what speed you are. You're never that far away from each other. But it's not necessarily a requirement to be on the track. I prefer personally to do them generally on the road, or like if you have like where Aime is, she has a really nice trail system, things like that, paved paths or crushed stone. And the reason I prefer them there over the track just generally is it's closer to the terrain that you will race on. We don't race on the track, right? Like triathlons don't take place on track. 5Ks generally don't take place on track. So it's a little better for assimilation and the simulation of speed. But that said, you also tend to run a little faster on the track because it's nice and flat. They also, most tracks, modern tracks nowadays have rebound in them. They're composite materials, so it makes you run a little fast, turns your legs over a little quicker. It also tends to be a little easier on the body from that perspective. So I do understand why people do them on the track, but I also think a lot of it is just there's such a association of speed workouts with the track that everybody thinks they have to be done there. And they don't. So use what you have around you. If you don't have access to a track like me, the closest track is like a 15-minute drive or so. So use it if you got it or if you want it, but it's definitely not a requirement. Now, as to getting faster at any age and what you can do, that is, there's a lot of kind of prongs on that tree and how you get there. Obviously the speed sessions, these strength sessions, these track workouts and things we're talking about are a critical component of it. But something to consider is that what you build around that session, the days leading up to, the days leading after, are equally as important. We're mostly triathletes as a rule. We train for 3 sports. Or 2 sports in the time of COVID with our pools all shut down and everything. So it's really critical to think about what you're putting around your speed sessions. For example, if you do a speed session in the morning on the track, say, trying to do a hard session that afternoon is not going to be helpful for you. Doing it on the bike or the swim, your fatigue is there. You have the inflammation in your body is already there. So the chances of overuse injuries or breakdown injuries go up dramatically if you start to stack hard efforts together. So when you are if you're planning a speed session, you want to make sure that the stuff around it is not going to be super intense. It allows you to be properly recovered and ready to do your speed session to the best of your ability, but it will also allow you to get the most adaptation out of it afterwards. So if you don't have a coach and you're or follow a training plan and you're structuring your own stuff, just keep that in mind, that you don't want to stack a bunch of hard stuff together because then you're going to end up on the injured list, and that's no fun for anybody. As far as how to build a speed workout to get the most out of it, there are 4 components to a good speed session. The first one is a warm up, right? Which everybody knows you're supposed to warm up. And everybody's body is a little different in how they warm up. I usually recommend at least 20 minutes of running before you go into a speed session. And it should be nice, aerobic, easy, like marathon effort or easier type running. Because all you're really doing is loosening everything up, priming the muscles, and that kind of thing to allow you to perform. At the tail end of that warm up, I like to add in a couple, a lot of people call them strides. Some people call them like bursts, where they're just 10, 15 seconds of quick turnovers, just to kind of get your body ready to run fast, right? Get that feeling in your legs. They're short, usually at least a minute or so in between each one. Because you don't want to fatigue yourself. You don't want to overrun them. You just want to get that elasticity in the muscles going and get your body kind of stretched out and strided out and ready to go. So you really have to have an adequate warm up if you're going to get, the most out of your speed session. Some people like to warm up and then do some dynamic stretching. That's perfectly fine. If you feel you need that, or if you're someone who needs more of a warm up, I don't typically stretch in a workout. So once I start my warm up, I'm progressing all the way through my workout, and then I do my recovery and stretching on the tail end of the intervals. But I do know people that like to do that, and that's kind of something that comes if you've ever run track or had any kind of a track background. They usually do dynamic stretching after warm up before intervals, and that's fine if if that's what you're comfortable with and that's what makes you feel the best. Obviously your body better than I will and ever will. Even if I were to work with you one-on-one for years, you would still know better than me. So listen to your body, take what it gives you, and err on the side of what you feel is going to benefit you the most. So that's the first of the 4 components of the speed session. The second component is the one that we all want to get to, right? And that's the actual interval. And depending on what you're training for, depending on what you're trying to adapt to, that can be anywhere from, even though, we don't run necessarily super far, right? Like a lot of us wouldn't consider a 5K to be far. In terms of sprinting, running fast, 5,000 is a really long race, right? When they run like 100 meters. So your strength session, speed session, that interval could be anywhere from 200 yards or meters, depending on where you are, up to 2 miles, right? It depends on what is the purpose of your workout, and the intensity that you're trying to put in. The purpose of your speed session should be one of 2 things. The interval should either be to make yourself physically faster, meaning that you should be running above and beyond your current race capability, right? And in that case, you're going to do shorter duration intervals because you can't sustain it for long. Like if you run a 9-minute mile and you're doing half-mile repeats at an 8-minute pace, that is going to make you faster overall as you progress through your training load. So that's what I mean by going above and beyond what you believe what your current abilities are. So one is to increase your physical speed. The second is to prepare yourself to run fast in a race, right? And so that would be like a race pacing thing. The intervals tend to be a little longer. Those are your half-mile, mile and a half, 2-mile type each interval. And you're doing them at or above, or at or slightly above your goal pace for the race. And that is to prepare your body physically, mentally, physiologically, to prepare yourself for where you're going to be on race day in terms of the suffering, what your stride is going to be like, what your form is going to be like, how to keep yourself going when you're hurting. If you're one of those people that likes to take yourself into that, deep, dark place, into the pain cave, that's as much mental as it is physical. So those type of longer intervals are great for preparing your, stealing your mind, so to speak, and preparing your body for having to go there. So generally, if I was building someone's training plan, they would have a training block is 3 to 4 weeks long, depending on the athlete. Depends on how injury prone they are, what their age is, what their goal races are, etc. So if we were doing a 4-week session, we'll say the first 2 weeks, each week would have one of these speed sessions we're talking about, and the intervals would be shorter. They would be those short intervals that are above their current ability. And that's because we're trying to get a little bit of speed in their legs and some adaptation there. And then the second 2, which would be leading into their taper for the race, would be those longer sessions that are more race specific, to then prepare them mentally as much as physically for where they're going to have to be on race day. So depending on what you're racing, what the distance is, right, you want to build into it that way. Start with the shorter ones, get your leg speed up, that kind of stuff. And then as you get closer to the race, stretch those intervals out to get more of a race feel, simulation, and adaptation. As far as what you should be focusing on in those fast intervals, the biggest thing in those intervals, like everybody's looking at the watch, right? It's all about what was my pace for that 400. And that makes sense, right? You want to know how fast you're going. But what you should really be focusing on is how you're running, how your running feels. Most injuries occur from overuse when they're doing, so poor form related injuries when you're doing intervals. And that's because we overreach physically, like stride wise, people tend to overreach when they're running fast because they're trying to lengthen their stride out, and they're trying to reach further with their front foot to go faster. And when you do that and your form falls apart, you start creating a lot more shock on your body. You take a lot more pounding, and so then those nagging hamstrings or knee injuries, hips, ankles, that stuff all tends to flare up when you overreach that way. So by focusing on how you're running, I'm talking about form. And while you can't see yourself right from the outside, there are a couple things you can think of. People run faster. Speed is, there's 2 things that add to speed. The first is your cadence while running. So the faster you turn your legs up to a point, the faster you're going to run. And the second one is the amount of time that you're in the air with each step. So if you look at elite, like just using them because they've been studied the most, elite level runners, their cadence from 5,000 or 10,000 meters, 5K, 10K up to a marathon, their cadence doesn't really change much. What changes is the amount of time that they're in the air. They're in the air longer in shorter races. So therefore they're traveling faster. So they have less ground contact time. So their stride is technically longer, but it's only where their front foot is landing is further out because they're traveling further through the air horizontally. They're not reaching farther. They're just pushing off harder and traveling further. So how do you do that? How do you get your cadence up and get yourself travel further? The easiest way to do it, because you can't see yourself, is to focus on your arms. Our arms swing in tune with our legs. It's how we maintain balance. It's how we maintain momentum. And most runners run with too low of a cadence as a whole. There are variances. There is a natural cadence for each individual that's a little different, but on a whole, from an efficiency standpoint, most people run with too low of a cadence. The easiest way to speed your cadence up is to actually swing your arms faster. Because if you swing your arms faster, which is something you can physically think about and control and has no negative impact on, say, like where your foot would land, your legs are going to have to speed up to keep up. You can't run and pump your arms really fast and have your legs turn over slow. It's your body is made to speed your legs up to keep up for balance. So when I'm doing speed sessions, I'm not actually focusing on the turnover of my legs. I'm not focusing on time. I'm focusing on my arm swing. The faster I can turn my arms over, and the more I can drive my arms, the faster my legs are going to turn over, and the more I'm going to push off and get more time off the ground and therefore run faster. And that's just kind of, we want to get faster without getting injured. So that's just a way to think about it, because we all want to run faster. We like to run hard all the time. We like to bike hard all the time, but you got to find a way that you can tune yourself into to do so without raising your risk of getting hurt. Especially, we're not 20, we're not a bunch of 15, 20-year-olds that can get up and go hard every day and not come up injured. So Hillary, you look like you're about to say something, but you're on mute. You're on mute, Hillary.
Didn't realize. You said 4 components of a speed workout. The
Yep.
first was the warm-up, about 20 minutes with some strides at the end. You then said intervals, 200 meters to 2 miles. What are the other 2?
So the third component is the recovery in between each interval, the rest interval. And that can be, depending on what you're trying to do, it could be anywhere from, if you're doing, say, really short intervals, say you're running 200 intervals, or if you're doing it by time, say you're running a minute, right? You're doing like a minute interval, just as an example. You could make that anywhere from, say, 30 seconds of rest to 2 minutes of rest, depending on what you're trying to do. So if you have less rest in between, the load that you're putting on yourself is going to be higher. And that would be more of that race adaptation type thing. If you're looking for building that pure speed earlier on in your training sessions, like we're talking about, then you actually would want to extend your rest interval. So you hear phrases a lot. They'll say, well, I was doing my speed work today and we were doing them on 1-to-1 intervals. So that would mean that if you run for a minute, your rest is also a minute, right? So they're the same. Or they'll say 1-to-2 where your rest is twice as long, or 2-to-1 where your rest is half as long. So when you hear somebody mention speed workouts, and if they're mentioning ratios, that ratio is, the first number is the time of the speed interval, and then its relation to the rest interval. So race adaptation stuff, the longer ones, if you're doing a mile and a half, 2 miles, or you're doing them by time and you're doing 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever, those you're going to want to shorten that rest interval, because it's long enough in terms of the duration of your speed that it's not a truly all out, because it's way too long to be an all out sprint, that you can shorten that rest interval up. And like I said, it'll make it more like a race simulation, versus if you're doing that short stuff and you're really winding it up, you want to give yourself plenty of time to recover before the next one, so that you're getting as much out of each one as you can.
Does it matter if you're doing distance versus time? I mean, I tend to do time when I do these speed workouts. Um,
So there used to be more of a debate. It's becoming less and less over training. Do you train by miles or do you train by time, like as a whole, right? Everybody used to train by mileage. Way back in the day, we all trained by miles. And then it started shifting to time. And now pretty much everybody, not everybody, but most of the people, near the top of their fields and stuff like that are training by time. Because the adaptation is actually, they're finding it's more time on your feet versus specific distances. My intervals are all done by time. I don't do them by mileage. But I understand people that do, and especially if you're doing them on the track, it's significantly easier to do them by mileage because the markings are on the ground in front of you, right? There's a mark, there's a line on the ground every 100 around the track, and you know that once around is a quarter mile. So depending on what they're doing, it's really easy to keep track of where you are in an interval. But I do time. All of my athletes, we do time. We don't do distance.
Can you talk a little bit about zones also? Like, so if you're doing these intervals and you're doing a 4 to 2 or 4 to 1 or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a 2 to 1 or a 1 to 1, what zones would you recommend?
So if you're doing a shorter interval, if we're going to use time or distance, say if you're doing quarter mile or less, or even if you're a good athlete, like up to maybe a half mile, if you're doing something short, like really short, and the purpose is speed, gaining speed, not race prep, you want to run them. Zones don't matter in this case, and the reason I say that is because your heart rate lags behind your effort. So when you start running hard, like if you're running at a 100 heart rate and I start sprinting, it's going to take time for my heart rate to say, oh, this is the effort he was putting in. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times by the time you get there, the interval is actually already over. So it's not really a good, if you're using heart rate training, it's not really a good way to monitor it. So in that case, if they're shorter intervals like that, you want them to be as hard as you can go and be able to do all of them, right? You don't want your first one to be a 6-minute mile and your last one to be an 30-minute mile pace when you go back and look at the data. You want them to be close. I find that people who actually get them really close, the first one ends up actually being a little slow because they're afraid of going too hard to start when they feel good. And that's okay. I would rather them get progressively harder as you go than have them go downhill the other way. Because when you're tired, if you're getting slower, you're not actually doing anything that's helping yourself. So with the really short ones, you run into that kind of stuff. If you're doing intervals because you're prepping, for 5K run or 10K run or something like that, if you're using zones 1 through 5, as a lot of people tend to use, if you run a 5K or 10K right, that is a zone 4 run. A 10K is pretty close to like what would be your threshold, which is what you can, consistently maintain for an hour. So that should be right there on that edge of zone 3 and 4. And then if you're doing something shorter like 5K, it should be zone 4, maybe into 5, depending on how long they take you to run, obviously. And also depending on how long you've been running. So your heart rate zones don't really change a lot in terms of beats per minute over time, over the years, but they might change a little, but a lot of that is actually genetic. What really changes is the amount of work that you can do within each zone range. is what changes. And then usually your resting heart rate goes down the fitter you get, but that doesn't generally have an impact on your zones. So if you're doing race prep type runs, those longer intervals, then you're going to want them to simulate, you know, what you would be doing on race day. So, you know, sprint, Olympic tri, 5K, 10K, you know, you're going to want to be in that zone 3 to zone 4 type of area. You know, if you're up in like a half Ironman type thing or a half marathon or a 10 miler type of a run, then you're going to want them to be, you know, low to mid zone 3, you know, and then it goes down, you know, marathons are running zone 2 up into the very maybe bottom of zone 3, depending on how good of a runner you are. You know, depends on how much you can hold that. But like there's a lot of charts, you know, anybody could Google heart rate zone for 5K, and most people use a 5-zone bracket, a 5-zone chart in some form. You know, some of them have 5 A, B, C, you know, and they're really small breakdowns or whatever. But if you look up, it says, oh, 10K should be in this zone, then you know when you're doing your race prep intervals, that's where you would want to be, so to speak.
And I believe that, I know that Training Peaks does it automatically for you. I think Final Surge does as well. And there's one question I had, and maybe we can open it up to the group. You had mentioned about eating or drinking prior to doing these speed workouts. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, you know, should you do something specific? Should it almost be like you're simulating a race experience when you're doing these?
For the most part, if you're doing a standalone speed session, you're going to the track to do your run. You're not. I wouldn't go into that as if I was fueling myself in an event. And the reason why is because you're not going to have all the load on your body beforehand. And the way your body responds to fueling under duress and fatigue and the load of a race is totally different from how it will beforehand. You're not shedding the calories, you're not burning the water weight, right? So if you go in and you're putting in, like in my case, if I was racing, if I'm putting in 300 calories an hour and drinking 2 bottles of fluid an hour, I'm going to feel like crap when I get to my speed workout. So I actually, yes, you want to be fed before you go. If you're someone like me who does intermittent fasting, I do not do bike or run speed sessions in the morning while I'm fasting, because you just can't get the most out of yourself that way. Your tank is already too close to empty. So those I tend to do later in the afternoon after I've had lunch and a snack. So you do want to make sure that you're fueled and you're well hydrated. But I wouldn't want to eat within like 2 hours of it, just because they're hard. They hurt, right? You're asking a lot of your body, and if you have a bunch of stuff sitting in your gut when you go, you know, and you're feeling kind of heavy or whatever, you're going to leave it on the track, and that's not really, that's not really a good experience that you want. So if I'm doing a really hard session, I try to get my food in 2 hours beforehand, and then you stay up on your fluids throughout your normal day-to-day like you should be doing anyway, and then you're going to be well hydrated. You're going to have plenty of speed workouts are almost entirely glycogen based because they're hard, so they're not fat burning workouts. So you'll have enough in the stores to do that if you give yourself a couple hours. But it'll just keep you from feeling that kind of heavy, bloaty, like where you just don't feel like you can go anywhere, kind of a feeling.
Thank you. So I'd like to open this up to everyone and see if you have specific questions that Coach Tim can answer.
Sure.
Tim, I don't think you addressed the warm down after
Yeah,
interval.
that's number 4
Cool down.
of the 4 is the cool down, the warm down. So there's you got to consider how long your overall session is going to be time wise. We don't often have like an hour and a half or 2 hours to put into a speed session where you can go do super long warm up, super long cool down. And depending on how much time you have, that affects the duration of your warm down or cool down. Generally speaking, if I'm doing track sessions, or like I do most of mine, I do them on hills. I do them as a hill session where I do my hard effort running uphill, and then I walk/jog back down. And the reason I do that is because it's very rare that someone gets injured running uphill. Your stride naturally shortens, your form is naturally better. It's easier on the joints, that kind of stuff. But I try to give myself at least 10 minutes of cool down running. And by that, that's going back to that, it's as easy as you need. For me, that's usually back down to like a marathon type effort or lower. And it's more just, if you hit your 10th interval, you hit your 10th 400, and then you take 2 minutes of rest, and then you're done, and you just get in the car while you're hot like that and leave, you're going to like lock up, you're going to tighten up, your hamstrings, you're going to be able to like flip yourself over and play a tune on your hamstrings when they tighten up. So I like to give myself a good 10 to 15 minutes. What I try to do is, however long the total duration of your intervals were, so intervals only, not the rest, you want to give yourself at least half that much time to cool down. So I prefer it to be this same amount of time or more, but if you're pressed for time, like, because a lot of people, it's going to be an hour or less total time because you got to go to work, you got to get showered, whatever you got to do. So try to make it, if you did 5 or say 10 minutes total worth of intervals, try to give yourself 10-minute cool down, or at least get as close to that as you can. If you can go over it, that's great. But at bare minimum, you want it to be half your total interval time, and it would not include your last recovery. So you hit your 10th run interval, you still have a 10th recovery to do, and then you would go into your cool down. So you can kind of use that as a guide. Try to get at least the same amount of time as your total intervals were, though, if you have it.
And static stretching afterwards, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't do a ton of static stretching as a whole, but I'm on the foam roller, the R8. I do a lot of kind of dynamic, movement stuff afterwards as part of my cool down. But that's just me personally, because that's what I've found works best for me. All of my friends that ran in high school and collegiately, they're over there killing that runner's stretch and killing their, getting that really nice quad pull, pulling their heel up to their butt, and the old school kind of stretching mentality. But they still kicked my butt during the run. So I can't say that they don't, that's good or bad. But you do want to do some kind of movement afterwards, whether it's static, dynamic, on the foam roller, whatever you do, you don't want to do it super hard. That's the thing. You don't want to get where you're getting really crazy pulls in it, because that will actually increase the amount of time that you need to recover instead of decreasing.
Anybody else?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so this is a little embarrassing, but I think I've got my hydration and nutrition pretty dialed in for my medically necessary diet. So I don't have a lot of flexibility, but I notice that the only time I ever get side stitches is when I'm doing speed work. And I'm talking, I measure the intensity of my speed work by how often, or the presence of actually barfing on a bush on the way back home. Like I'll actually barf because I'm going so hard. Even if it's like short intervals, I will actually puke on bush.
Yeah.
What is that about? Because I have not been able to solve that piece, and I just feel like an anomaly.
So if, next time we do this, I'll have my wife on here because she's like, well, if you ever want to know, like if Tim raced, when you get near the finish line, just look for the guy who's dry heaving.
Yeah.
And it could be 5K, it could be a half marathon, it could be a marathon, like it doesn't matter. But if you watch elite athletes, like just not necessarily for the time, but if you've ever watched ITU racing, Olympic racing, that kind of stuff, watch cross country skiing or biathlon, like they all just have to lay down at the finish line so they don't die. Like it's, and that's not an anomaly. What I have found, this is anecdotal, this is from my experience as a coach working with other athletes and having friends and stuff like that, is there are 3 different levels of racers, and that is not based on time or ability or anything like that. There are the people who are racing, just they enjoy the atmosphere, they're just trying to better themselves a little bit, and they're out there just solely for the experience. And that person could be a 5-minute miler, it doesn't matter. And then there's the people that I call the uncomfortable racers, which are the people that they have no problem pushing up to a point. And when the race gets on, when they start to get uncomfortable, that is their line and that is their limit. And that is where they want to stop. And then there are the people who I call it total immersion. And that is like, that's that type of athlete I am. And that is when I'm in the race, when I get to the finish line, I could finish first. I could finish 450 first. When I'm done, there is nothing left. Like my efforts are paced and based upon the distance that I am competing in. So when I get to the line, my body is already like, it's quitting. It's telling me that we're done. And that's, I finish, I'm on my hands and knees, I'm over dry heaving somewhere. I try to find somewhere I can lay down. I very rarely actually get sick because I don't usually race with a ton of stuff in my gut. But I hack and cough, and I'm probably like the most embarrassing person in the finish area because you could hear me from like a half a mile away. But that's more being able to take yourself further mentally than physically. So there's a line that comes in racing and training where things are no longer feeling good or they don't feel like something you can continue. And most people will edge up to that line and stop. And other people just forget that line is there and they blow on past it, and they either blow up in race, or if they pace it correctly or close to correctly, then they end up being that idiot at the finish line. So I wouldn't say that's effort related, not nutrition, fluids, like that kind of stuff. That's effort based.
Interesting.
And you should be proud of yourself.
It doesn't feel very proud. It always happens at the end of my speed work. So I'm working up to faster and faster speeds, and
now,
suddenly I find myself.
Now, as far as the side stitch as a whole goes, because that was like a small piece of your statement, there's 2 things that can cause the side stitch. One is breathing related. A lot of people, when they work hard, they tend to hold their breath, which can create, it's weird. Like when people are under duress, they hold their breath. You just kind of lock up, right? Right. Think about it. If you're lifting weights and you're working hard, how many people have you seen like at the gym on the bench press and their face is blood red because they're not breathing, right? And or you see it all the time when people are swimming, especially, right? Because you have to time your breathing. So if someone's doing like a 50 or 100, they like all of a sudden start flailing because they realize they haven't taken a breath. So part of it can be breathing related. Part of it can be physical. You have these things in between your ribs called intercostal muscles, you know, and it's I guess it's a muscle. It's more like kind of an elastic, more like a cartilage. And your ribs are actually supposed to have a little bit of movement. And so if that area gets tight and is rigid and is locked down, that can create that feeling. I had a race that I got a really bad side stitch in a 5K about 2 miles in, and I ran through it as best I could. And I got to the end and I was like doubled over in pain. And I'm like, the side stitch will let itself go. And it wouldn't. I couldn't get it to release for like over an hour. And I couldn't figure out why. You know, usually as soon as your heart rate goes down, your breathing gets under control, it starts to get better. I went to PT, and it turned out that I had actually strained the intercostal area in between my ribs. And I ended up like, I couldn't push for like 2 months. It was like recovering from like a tear, even or a normal muscle strain. So I would guess it's probably breathing related first. Because I feel like you take pretty good care of yourself. So I would bet that your mobility and movement there is probably pretty decent. But that would be my guess first and foremost, would be that it's breathing related.
That's interesting. Anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, one more, Tim. What about strength workouts to complement the intervals?
Yeah, so strength can come in a couple different forms. Most people think of strength, they think of hill workouts, right? Like, it's like, strength session, you go run hills. Strength and speed are, to me personally, strength sessions and speed sessions are generally like what most people would consider a speed session, I would consider strength. And the purpose of that, whether it's hill running, track running, whatever, the purpose is to get faster. Like I said, you have to increase cadence and you have to increase or decrease ground contact time. The way you do that is by pushing off harder on your back foot, right? So you have to increase your muscular ability to do that. Now, in that case, like I said, that's why I prefer doing my intervals on hills. It gives me the speed complement of turning my legs over. I pick a moderate grade, pretty steady, something in, like 5%, 3 to 5% grade or somewhere around there. It's steep enough to know you're on a hill. It's shallow enough to allow you to run the hill well, as opposed to like if something's super steep and you're just kind of chopping your feet like you're running up the stairs kind of a thing. So if you build the strength component in terms of hill running, things like that, the speed will automatically come. So most of my speed is done as those race specific workouts I was talking about, those race adaptation. So I'll do my pure speed sessions on the hills, and literally do hill repeats, or I'll do a tempo run where I'm running a certain effort, and when, which is forcing me to run a certain way. And when I get to the hill, instead of lessening my effort up the hill to try to keep my heart rate in check, I will maintain the effort and allow my heart rate to climb and then recover over the other side. And that becomes my interval, right? So you drive through the hill and then, and then take your foot off the gas after you've crested the top. Excuse me. As far as the race adaptation speed sessions, for me, that would be like, I'm going out for an hour run and we're going to do warm up, and then we're going to do 2 by 15 minutes in zone 4, say, with 5 minutes of rest in between. And that is normal road running. So when I get into those 15-minute intervals, that is when I'm focusing on the foot speed, and I'm noted and getting the real speed part of the adaptation in. The strength creates the speed later. So you don't necessarily feel like you're running all that fast when you're, running uphill, right? Your times don't reflect it. But if you get that in beforehand, when you go, if you're doing that leading into the race adaptation stuff, when it's time to hit that longer interval and to turn your legs up, they will be there when you need them to be. And it's the most practical approach for most people. There are some people that can do tons of speed work because they're very durable. And those people I'll put on a track, hills, fartlek type runs, a whole lot of different variability in the speed sessions. But most of them, this is what they do, right? Like they run their triathletes. They're either elites or they're professionals or they're collegiate or, that kind of thing. So this is their main focus. For most people that have 9 to 5s, they have families, they're above the age of 35, that kind of stuff. When you can't pile a whole lot on because life, age, health all dictate it, it's a lot easier to do it incrementally like that and lessen your chance of injury, and you're not pushing the envelope as much because we all have to get up and go to work the next day, and you got to be home and get the kids to practice and whatever else there is to do. So we can't just pile it on.
Quick question.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, quick question. So in the beginning, when we started, I had said that you're going to talk about running at any age.
Yes.
Can you get faster as you age?
It depends on where you start. If you were a high school and collegiate cross-country runner, above the age of 35, no. You're not, because you were already at the top, right? You're already here. Most people that come into triathlon, they come in their 30s and 40s generally, right? You're older, you have a career, the kids, if you have a family, the kids are now kind of old enough to, that you don't have to keep them alive every day, all day, every day. They can kind of maintain themselves somewhat. Then those people come in. Those people, you absolutely can get faster. The biggest component to getting faster is being consistent. So it takes about 7 years of consistent aerobic training to become aerobically efficient. Like, you get more efficient every time, but it takes about 7 years to really plateau that. And that's being, not, well, I hit 60% of my workouts this week. Like, that's honest to goodness consistency, like 80% or more of your workout. Life doesn't usually allow that, of course, right? Things get in the way. So I'm using that to say, yeah, you definitely can, because most likely you're not even getting close to the amount out of yourself that you could, right? So you can usually, if you start in this as an adult, the first 10 to 12 years, you can continue to get faster, even if you're training pretty consistent, because you're not training at your optimum, because you don't have 20 hours a week, 30 hours a week to train. So
what would you recommend a good, consistent run with all the other things that you're doing would be?
Yeah, so it's very, as far as time or mileage or anything like that, that's obviously very personal, and it's based on your own durability and things like that. But with that said, like, if you have time during the week to say 2 days during the week or 3 days during the week, not on the weekends, you can get out and run 30 or 40 minutes, right? If you can, and then you run a longer run on the weekend, and it could be 45 minutes, it could be an hour, whatever that is, depending on your ability. If you can hit those 4 days a week for weeks and for months, and if you miss one here or there, like the occasional miss is fine, as long as you're not creating a pattern of misses, or starting to string together a bunch of misses. But whatever the time is that you have to work with, if you can consistently hit it, then you'll continue to grow. Now you will get to a plateau where either you have to decide, can I afford more time, or do I want to afford more time, or do I have more time, right? And that's everybody's own personal thing. Some people get fully immersed in this lifestyle and it becomes, you know, your life outside of work, right? You have work, training, family, and it becomes 3 pieces, right? Some people, they don't want to commit more to it, and that's fine. Like, that's okay. Because it still should be fun and something that you want to do. But once you hit that plateau, it becomes, well, now what do I do? Do I want to dedicate more time, or do I now change how I use my time? So if you've been consistently hitting those 4 days we talked about for weeks and months, and you've been hitting them and hitting them and hitting them, okay, now let's take one of those runs during the week, and we're going to make it a hard session during the week, right? And say that long run on the weekend, we're going to turn that into what I would call a tempo session. So that could be some race type intervals in it, or if you're running in zone 2 because it's aerobic and that's what you should be doing for your long run, make the last 15 minutes of it like half marathon effort or something like it, right? Just it's going to be the overall body of work of it will be aerobic, but you will get some tempo type work, something a little faster, more race adaptation at the tail end without having to really increase your recovery time. So then you're just changing the work you're doing within your time parameters. But you can't do that for all your workouts because you need adequate time to recover. You're still trying to balance everything else. And the other thing to consider as we get older is it's good to have your hard days, right? But you don't want to make them super duper long. So like your long run should very, 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 very rarely be a really hard run, because it takes exponentially longer to recover from. So if you go super hard on Sunday morning's run, well, your runs for the whole following week are not going to be optimal runs because it's going to take you a week to recover. And that's what I dislike most about marathon training is like logging long miles on the road. They're hard on the body. Even if they're not a hard effort, it's still hours and hours on your feet, hours and hours of pounding, lots of inflammation, and it takes time to recover. Personally, I can't do those. My body breaks down about 3/4 of the way through marathon training if I do it like this more standard form of marathon training. So I do mine differently.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Did you have a last question before we end?
Actually, I was thinking of something else, but does that 7-year rule about becoming aerobically efficient, does that apply to swimming and biking as well?
Biking, I would say it's easier to become aerobically efficient biking. And the reason I say that is because it is more aerobically demanding on its own. Running by nature tends to be a little more muscular because you're physically fighting gravity with every step and driving yourself off the ground. Swimming, it really depends on your swimming background and where you come from. If you're learning to swim as an adult, no, if you commit to swimming, so say you're swimming, and by commit, I mean adult commit, not like the high school swim team commit. Like, but if you can be in the pool 3 days a week, which most people swim 2 to 3 days a week as adults. Mm-hmm. If you can be in the pool 3 days a week, you can become aerobically pretty efficient in about 2 years. And that is with having fairly proper form. It doesn't have to be perfect, but not like flailing and drowning like I spent my first 3 years trying to do. Like I never became aerobically efficient because I was just trying to keep my head above water. But once I got my form straightened out, it took about 2 years to where I hit my first real plateau. And then it was like, okay, well, now I'm here. Now what do I do? And then it started becoming more about incremental work. If someone comes from a swimming background and they're getting back in as an adult, it's a little different ball game, because if you swam in your youth, you probably swam 6 days a week and a lot of 2-a-days. And if you were in high school, you had weeks where you swam 100K in a week, you know, and in tail end high school and college. And that's those people, they're already good in the water in terms of form and everything else. So they actually will get to a plateau pretty quick, and then they have to decide, do I want to swim 5 days a week or do I want to swim 2 to 3? Because they would have to go to like 5 to continue to grow, versus someone who learned to swim really as an adult would not. It would take a long time to get to the point where you have to make that decision.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Coach Tim. We appreciate your time, and this was really informative. A lot of great tips and strategies. So thank you. Thank you all,
Absolutely.
guys, for joining in. It's great to see you all. And until next time.
Have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.